They called her cursed before she even reached the harbor. The Princess Augusta came in under a sky the color of tarnished silver, her sails hanging like shrouds. She should have been a thing of beauty, her hull a proud arc of seasoned oak, her masts sharp and clean against the horizon. But there was no joy in her arrival. Those who stood on the wharf that morning remembered an unnatural quiet. No creak of rigging, no shouted orders from the deck, only the slow, deliberate lap of water against her bow, as if the sea itself were unwilling to let her go. It is said the people who first caught sight of her that day crossed themselves or muttered charms under their breath. They could not have known the tally of the dead. They could not have read the logbook inked in a hand that grew shakier with each entry. But they could see the faces, what few there were pale as bone, staring out from behind the rails. And perhaps they noticed how the ship's figurehead, once a proud maiden with hair flying in the wind, now bore streaks of black down her carved cheeks, as though she too had been weeping in the salt air. Welcome to the Archive of Folly. Here we keep the stories that refuse to stay buried, the ones balanced on that thin, treacherous line between fact and fable. Tonight, I'll take you back to the autumn of 1738, when the Princess Augusta limped into port with more shadows than sailors. You will hear what history records and what legend insists. For the truth of this voyage lies not only in the ink of official records, but in the whispers that followed her for generations. If you find yourself drawn to these histories, where ambition and calamity are forever intertwined, then make a quiet place here among us. Subscribe to the archive, and I will keep the lamp burning for you, so that whenever you return, the door will be open. The Princess Augusta was not built for tragedy. She was born, as all East Indiamen were, for glory and profit. Her first voyages were to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, and then, more ambitiously, toward the long, perilous routes that curved across the Atlantic, around Africa's Horn, and up into the Indian Ocean. Such ships were floating kingdoms, part warship, part merchant palace, carrying spices, silk, tea, and porcelain to feed the hungers of Europe's growing middle class. Her owner, one Thomas Roe, had seen the tide of fortune turning eastward. In the coffee houses of London, where deals were sealed with ink and coin, he had heard of fortunes made in a single voyage. The sea was dangerous, yes, but the profit was magnificent. A single crate of fine tea could fetch the wages of an entire ship's crew. A cargo of Chinese porcelain could finance a gentleman's retirement. And so the Princess Augusta was fitted for her grandest journey yet, a return from the Orient, her hold to be heavy with treasures. The log begins with fine weather and a full complement of men. Captain James Carrick was an old hand of the trade salt-stained, weather-worn, and utterly devoted to the rhythms of the sea. His first mate, William Foster, was younger, restless, ambitious, and kept a private journal that would later prove invaluable, though also strangely incomplete. The voyage out was long but uneventful, save for a single storm off the Cape that tested the Augusta's timbers but did no real harm. She arrived at her eastern port records disagree on whether it was Canton or Batavia with holds, ready to receive the wealth of another continent. It was during the return voyage, however, that unease began to creep in. The first deaths were explained away. A fever here, a fall from the rigging there. Ships lose men. It is the nature of the sea. But then, as the Augusta crossed the mid-Atlantic, illness seemed to spread from bow to stern. Foster wrote of men who coughed until their lips turned blue, of hands too weak to pull rope, of bodies sewn into canvas and slipped overboard under a moon as pale as the faces on deck. The official records speak of contagion, but the stories that grew in the taverns were different. Some claimed the sickness began the moment a particular crate was brought aboard. A carved chest from the Orient, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl, its lock heavy and ornate. Others said the trouble began when the crew took aboard a passenger, a merchant who had lost his ship, and who brought with him an idol wrapped in red silk. Whatever the truth, there was a sense aboard the Augusta that something unseen was moving among them. Foster wrote that the ship felt too heavy in the water, though her cargo was no more than planned. Sailors swore the figurehead's eyes seemed to follow them. Carrick, a man not given to superstition, began to keep a small silver cross in his pocket, touching it before giving any order. By the time the Augusta sighted land again, more than half her crew was gone. The survivors were gaunt and silent. The ship, once proud, now carried with her the stench of sickness. In some tellings of the story, the townsfolk who came to unload her cargo refused to touch it, claiming that death clung to every bale of silk and every crate of tea. But perhaps the most curious thing is this. The Augusta's log ends abruptly, mid-sentence 3 days before she made port. The last entry is in Foster's hand, and it reads simply, "The wind has shifted, but it is not the wind I fear." And here, as history fades into rumor, the myth takes root. Some say a shadow was seen moving along her decks on nights when all the surviving crew were asleep below. Some say the carved maiden at her prow changed her expression with the tide. And some, especially in the years that followed, insisted that every ship that took on her timbers and refitting came to a bad end. This is where the records grow silent and the whispers grow loud. The Princess Augusta was broken up not long after, her timbers sold to smaller merchantmen. Of those ships, at least 3 were lost at sea within 2 years. Coincidence? Or the working out of a curse that crossed oceans with her? But the story does not end here, for there are still letters, some in neat copperplate, others in a hurried scrawl, preserved in the damp archives of maritime offices. And in them, we hear the voices of men who tried to explain what had happened and perhaps, in doing so, left clues to something stranger still. I can carry us into those letters next, if you'd like me to continue. The first letter is dated the 14th of November 1738, written from an inn on the edge of the harbor by William Foster himself. His handwriting, usually disciplined and narrow, wanders on the page like a man who cannot quite hold a straight course. The voyage is done, though I cannot tell whether to give thanks for it. I have seen men die before, but never so many, and never so quietly, as if each one simply folded into himself and drifted out like a lamp's last breath. I have spoken to no one of the chest, for I cannot prove what I know in my heart. It was taken aboard in the East, a gift or a bargain, I never learned which. Captain Carrick insisted it remain lashed in the after hold, where the shadows lie deepest. I would wager a year's wages it was never opened. Yet I would swear on my mother's soul that some nights I heard something shift within it, as though restless in sleep. The chest appears again in another letter, this one unsigned, and found years later among the effects of a shipwright's widow. She claimed it was written by her husband's brother, a stevedore, who helped unload the Princess Augusta. I told them I'd not touch it. It was warm to the hand, though it had been in the hold all the voyage home. Warm, like a living thing. No nails or screws held it shut, only that great iron lock. And when the sun struck its surface, the pearl inlay seemed to move, like fish turning in water. These letters, one from the officer's desk, the other from the dockside laborer frame, the ship's return in 2 perspectives. The disciplined fear of a sailor bound to his duty, and the raw, superstitious dread of a man who need only trust his senses. It would be easy to dismiss both accounts as embellishment. After all, a long voyage breeds unease, and the human mind loves to give shape to the shapeless. Yet the curse of the Princess Augusta did not end with her dismantling. We find the next echo in 1741, in the log of the Mercy Ann, a smaller merchant brig built partly from the Augusta's timbers. The log entries are terse at first, routine notes of wind, heading, and provisions, but then the captain begins remarking upon night voices. He describes hearing a woman's low lamentation near the prow, though no female passengers were aboard. His first mate reports seeing a figure on the bow at dawn, dressed in what looked like seaweed, vanishing the moment it was hailed. Within 6 months, the Mersey Ann was lost off the coast of Ireland. Maritime historians, those allergic to ghost stories, insist such accounts are merely the sea's old habit of coincidence. A doomed ship here, a bad season there? Yet the sailors, those who live and die by the creak of rope and the whisper of wind, were less willing to shrug it away. They gave the curse a name, the Augusta's widow. To some, she was the carved figurehead come to life. To others, the spirit of a woman wronged long before the ship was ever built, now bound to her wood. Foster's surviving pages grow stranger in this light. Weeks after his first letter, he writes again, this time from his family home, describing a dream that visited him nightly. I walk the deck under a starless sky. The wind is steady, but the sails are slack. The chest is there before me, yet now it is open. Inside there is no cargo, only a mirror, and in it I see not my own face, but hers, the figurehead smiling with her mouth closed tight as if holding back words. It is here the line between man and myth blurs beyond easy untangling. Was Foster unraveling after months at sea, plagued by guilt for those lost under his watch? Or had he, in some way, been marked by whatever shadow the Augusta carried home? In December of that year, his name appears in a parish record beside a brief note, departed this life suddenly, cause unknown. No coroner's report survives. No burial place is marked. But what we do have is the weather log for that week. It notes a sudden squall off the coast, wind screaming in from the east, and an unaccountable sighting by local fishermen. A dark ship riding the storm with sails full, though the wind was against her. She was gone in minutes, swallowed by cloud and rain. When pressed, the fishermen swore she had no crew visible aboard. And so, in a kind of echo, the Princess Augusta seemed to sail again, not as a ship of wood and cargo, but as a shape in the minds of those who had touched her fate. The myth had grown teeth. In the years that followed, every maritime death along that stretch of coast seemed, in the telling, to draw the Augusta's shadow closer. A fishing smack overturned in calm weather? The widow was seen on the waves. A merchant ketch lost its rudder in clear seas? The curse had drifted down to them. Stories fed stories, until the legend seemed as real as any entry in a ship's log. Still, the archivist in me must ask, what truth hides beneath the barnacles of all this retelling? Illness can ravage a crew without supernatural cause. A fine chest with pearl inlay may seem uncanny when carried across half the world. And yet, there is something about the stubborn survival of this tale, passed from logbook to tavern to widow's letter, that makes me think the curse was more than just fever and fear. If there is an answer, it may lie in the east, where the voyage began, and where the Augusta's most fateful cargo was first taken aboard. That is where we must now go, if we wish to know what truly came across the sea. The trail leads back to a crowded dockside in Batavia, a port city swollen with the mixed scents of spice, tar, and decay. In 1738, it was the beating heart of the Dutch East Indies, a place where fortunes were made by men who might not live to spend them. Fever stalked its streets, rats claimed its wharves, and the harbor lay thick with ships from every corner of the known world. The Princess Augusta had arrived late in the season, her crew eager to load and depart before the monsoon winds turned. Most of her cargo was contracted weeks in advance. Tea packed in lacquered chests, bolts of silk, crates of porcelain nested in straw. But there was one last-minute addition, a transaction so small and so poorly documented that it barely grazes the official records. It is mentioned only once, in a receipt scrawled in Dutch on coarse paper. Een kist met ingelegd perl, onbekend herkomst. A chest with pearl inlay, origin unknown. No name of the seller, no details of the payment. Just a mark in the ledger and the date, the 3rd of August, 1738. The chest, if the descriptions in later letters are to be trusted, was unlike anything common to the trade. It was not the square, practical sort used for tea or sugar. Its shape was elongated, almost coffin-like, with inlay that formed a pattern neither wholly geometric nor floral something between the two. A design that seemed to shift as the eye lingered. The iron lock was broad and ornate, its key absent from the purchase. Here, too, the myth threads itself into the facts. A sailor's account, written decades later and rife with the exaggerations of memory, insists the chest came from a Javanese widow whose husband had died at sea. She sold it for a pittance, eager to be rid of it. In her tongue, she called it the mouth that swallows luck. Whether this was a warning or a boast is left to the imagination. Captain Carrick, pragmatic to a fault, would have seen no reason to refuse it. Freight was freight, and a carved chest would fetch a fine price in Europe. It was stowed in the after hold, where the ship's sway was gentlest, and there it remained through calm and storm alike. But the East remembers what the West prefers to forget. Among the Malay dockworkers who helped load the Augusta, the story of the chest was already old. They said it had been carried before on a vessel bound for Malacca that vanished without a trace, on a Portuguese caravel that limped into Goa with only 2 survivors, both of whom died within days. The chest always returned to port, sold to the next captain willing to risk the voyage. The myth was simple and precise. Whatever ship bore it would bring home riches, but at the cost of blood. If Carrick ever heard these warnings, he kept them to himself. Foster's later journal entries from Batavia make no mention of anything amiss, only of the oppressive heat, the endless work of loading, and a fleeting encounter with a local child who offered him a string of carved beads in exchange for a copper coin. The first sign that the voyage home would be different came within a week of leaving port. A seaman named Hargreaves was found dead in his hammock, his face marked not by injury, but by a strange, almost serene stillness. No sign of fever, no wound, no struggle. They buried him at sea with the customary rites, the splash of his weighted shroud swallowed quickly by the warm, green water. Days later, another man died. Then another. This time, fever did strike, the kind that dries the lips, clouds the eyes, and leaves the body trembling even in still air. Foster wrote that the illness seemed to skip some men entirely, while striking others down overnight. No amount of vinegar wash, no fumigation of quarters, could slow its march. It was then, he said, that the whispers began. The chest in the after hold was to blame. It had been loaded without blessing or bargain, without the proper offerings. Some wanted to throw it overboard, but Carrick refused. Cargo was cargo, and every piece had been paid for. Still, Foster noted a change in the captain. The man who once walked the deck with the assurance of one who knows his ship now seemed to keep to the quarterdeck, watching the horizon with a fixed and uneasy stare. On more than one occasion, Foster caught him glancing aft, toward the place where the chest lay hidden from the sun. By the time they crossed the Cape of Good Hope, 20 men were gone. The Augusta's decks were scrubbed daily to keep the stench at bay, but the sea air could not mask the sense of something lingering, something that waited for them as patiently as it had waited in the dark hold. From here, the tale becomes harder to parse. The official log marks each death with a precise date and location, yet in the margins, faint enough that they are barely visible now, are notes in another hand. Heard the knocking again, eyes in the dark, lock warm to the touch. Whether these are Foster's scribbles or the work of some later, more imaginative archivist, I cannot say. But I can tell you this. Those notes end 3 days before the Augusta made landfall. And the last words, faded but legible, are these: "She will not be content here." The East may have sent the chest westward, but what followed would make the western ports fear as deeply as any far-off harbor. And it is here, on the cusp of her arrival, that the curse would change shape from a whispered warning among sailors to a story the entire town would claim to have seen. The Princess Augusta came into harbor under a sky that seemed too still for the season. The air heavy, the water sluggish. From the quay, the townsfolk saw her sails droop like tired wings. What they could not see was the deck itself scoured clean of blood or sickness, yet carrying the memory of both. It was said the first man to board her after she moored was the harbor master. He found Captain Carrick standing at the rail, his face pale and drawn, his coat too loose on his frame. When asked for the ship's manifest, Carrick produced it with shaking hands. His voice, though quiet, was steady enough until the harbor master asked about the chest. Carrick, according to a later affidavit, did not answer immediately. He turned his head toward the afterhold and seemed to listen for something. Only then did he say, "It will be unloaded last." The unloading took 3 days. The town stevedores handled bales of silk, crates of tea, and stacks of porcelain with their usual briskness, but they worked more slowly as they moved aft. The smell there was different, not the sour rot of illness, but a faint, sweet, almost floral scent, like something long buried and newly unearthed. When at last the chest came into view, a crowd had gathered on the quay. The inlay did indeed shimmer in the weak sun, the patterns changing with the angle, the pearl flashing with colors that seemed too vivid for the day's gray light. Its lock was unbroken. 2 men carried it down the gangplank, though one swore afterward it felt heavier than it had any right to be. Where the chest went next is the part of the record that frays. One version says it was claimed by a merchant who stored it in his warehouse. Another insists it was purchased by a collector who later vanished at sea. In either case, it left the Augusta's deck and disappeared into private hands. But the curse, if curse it was, did not fade. Within weeks of her arrival, fever spread through the town. Some claimed it came from the cargo, that the silks of the tea carried the same unseen blight that had hollowed the Augusta's crew. Others whispered that it was no illness at all, that the widow had left her prow and walked ashore, seeking those who had dared touch what was hers. The deaths mounted, shops closed, the church bells tolled daily, and in the shadows of the taverns, the tale began to shape itself into something the sea would remember. A ship that brought home wealth, yes, but trailed ruin behind her. Captain Carrick died before the year was out. The parish clerk noted only decline as the cause. Foster, as you know, had gone before him. Of the original crew, barely a handful lived to see another voyage. The Princess Augusta herself was stripped for parts within 2 years. Her timbers were sold to smaller ships, and with them, the curse spread like ink in water. 3 of those vessels were lost in quick succession. Another returned half empty, her captain raving of a woman's voice that sang from the waves on moonless nights. Sailors came to speak of her, not as the Augusta, but as the widow's ship. In some versions, the figurehead was said to come alive in storms, her hair streaming and her eyes bright with something like hunger. In others, she simply appeared on the deck at night, her feet silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon. As for the chest, its trail vanishes entirely after those first few months ashore. Some say it was broken open, its contents nothing but old cloth and a tarnished mirror. Others insist it was never opened at all, and that it still lies somewhere, waiting for the next ship to carry it. And this is where fact and fable knot themselves so tightly that they are nearly the same rope. Did the Augusta truly bring a curse across the sea? Or was she simply an unlucky vessel, caught in the grip of disease and coincidence? Her story magnified by the fear of those who survived her? What I know is this. 2 centuries later, the fishermen along that coast still tell of a black-hulled ship that rides the mist just after dawn. Her sails are ragged, her decks empty. She makes no sound, save for the faint creak of wood and a knock slow, deliberate of something shifting in her hold. And if you stand on the shore and watch her pass, they say, you may glimpse her figurehead, her eyes glinting in the gray light. as though she is searching for someone she once carried and means to carry again. That is the story, as I have found it, written in ledgers, whispered in taverns, etched into the grain of old timbers. The Princess Augusta sailed only once with that chest aboard, yet the voyage has never truly ended. The widow is still out there, somewhere between wind and wave, memory and myth, waiting for the moment when some captain, old or foolish, gives her passage home.